My name is Farhan Maller. I am 37 years old, and at the time this story happened, I believed I understood people fairly well. I owned a commercial laundry company called Blue Harbor Linen Works in Porch, a coastal city known for its shipping terminals, old industrial districts, and busy waterfront businesses. The company was not large compared to the corporations downtown, but it was successful enough to provide a comfortable life. Every day followed almost the same routine. I woke up at 4:45 a.m. By 5:30 a.m., I unlocked the front gate of the facility. By 6 a.m., delivery trucks began arriving. By 7 a.m., employees filled the building. My life was predictable. That was why I immediately noticed her. Her name was Isela Voss. The first time I saw her was during the final week of September. She sat alone beneath a damaged bus shelter across the street from my business. She looked exhausted. 2 old suitcases rested beside her. Her clothes were clean but heavily worn. Her hair was tied back carelessly, and her eyes constantly scanned the surrounding area as if she expected someone to appear at any moment. At first, I assumed she was simply waiting for transportation. Porch's public transit system often experienced delays. I thought nothing more about it. The next morning, however, she was there again. So was the morning after that. And the morning after that. Each day she occupied the same location. Each day she sat quietly. Each day she appeared to have nowhere else to go. The situation became difficult to ignore. One Thursday morning, while carrying coffee into my office, I glanced across the street and saw her shivering in the cold wind coming from the harbor. For several seconds, I stood there watching. Then I made a decision. I crossed the street. "Excuse me," I said. She looked up immediately. Her expression suggested she expected trouble. Instead, I handed her the spare coffee. "Thought you might want this." For a moment she seemed surprised. Then she accepted it. "Thank you." Her voice sounded tired. That was our first conversation. It lasted less than 30 seconds. I returned to work. The next morning, I brought coffee again. This time I also brought a breakfast sandwich. She thanked me politely. Nothing more. Days became weeks. Weeks became a month. The routine continued. Coffee, breakfast, a brief conversation, then work. Despite seeing her almost every day, I learned surprisingly little about her. Whenever I asked questions about her background, she answered carefully. Sometimes she redirected the conversation. Sometimes she simply smiled and remained silent. The few details she did share seemed ordinary. Her name was Isela Voss. She had lived in Porch years earlier. She had recently returned. She was trying to solve a personal problem. That was all. One morning in October, heavy rain covered the city. The streets flooded. The harbor disappeared behind gray fog. When I arrived at work, I found Isela sitting beneath the shelter, soaked despite her efforts to stay dry. That was when I felt genuinely concerned. After opening the facility, I walked back outside. "You can't stay here in weather like this." She looked away. "I'll be fine." "No, you won't." I reached into my wallet. "There is a motel 6 blocks from here. Let me pay for a room." She immediately shook her head. "No." I frowned. "Why not?" For the first time, uncertainty appeared on her face. Then she gave an answer that made very little sense. "Not yet." That was all she said. Not yet. No explanation followed. No additional details. Just those 2 words. I remember standing there feeling confused. Most people in her position would have accepted help immediately. Instead, she looked nervous. Almost frightened. As though leaving that location would create a problem. Eventually, I returned to work. But her response stayed in my mind for the rest of the day. The following weeks passed without major changes. Porch entered late autumn. Temperatures dropped. Business increased. Hotels prepared for holiday travel. Restaurants ordered larger deliveries. Meanwhile, Isela continued appearing every morning. Some days she seemed relaxed. Other days she appeared tense. Occasionally, I caught her studying old papers and maps spread across her lap. Whenever I approached, she quickly packed them away. I assumed they contained personal information. I never pressed the issue. Then came November. And everything changed. It happened on a Monday. I arrived at the facility shortly before sunrise. The bus shelter was empty. At first, I thought Isela might simply be late. Hours passed. She never appeared. The next day she remained absent. The day after that, she was still gone. 3 consecutive mornings. No sign of her. No message. No explanation. I felt strangely worried. After seeing someone almost every day for months, their sudden disappearance leaves a noticeable absence. Part of me wondered whether she had finally found somewhere to stay. Another part feared something had happened. 3 more days passed. Then, shortly after 10 o'clock on a Friday morning, my receptionist called my office. "Farhan, there's someone here asking for you." I was reviewing delivery schedules. "Who is it?" There was a pause. Then she answered. "A woman named Isela." Relief hit me immediately. But that feeling lasted only a second. Because my receptionist continued speaking. "She's not alone." I looked toward the office door. "What do you mean?" Another pause. Then came the sentence that changed everything. "She brought a lawyer." The moment I heard those words, every possible worst-case scenario rushed through my head. Had I unknowingly done something wrong? Was she planning to sue me? Had our months of interaction been some kind of setup? Questions filled my mind. I stood from my desk and walked toward the reception area. And when I finally saw Isela again, I immediately realized something was different. The nervous woman who had spent months sitting at the bus shelter was gone. In her place stood someone calm, focused, confident. Beside her stood a sharply dressed lawyer carrying several thick folders. Isela looked directly at me. Then she said words I never expected to hear. "Farhan, I need to tell you the truth." At that moment, I had no idea that the story I believed about her was completely wrong. And I certainly had no idea that my own property sat at the center of a battle involving missing records, hidden ownership claims, and one of the most powerful men in Greyport. The moment I entered the reception area, every employee nearby stopped pretending to work and started pretending not to watch. Isela Voss stood beside a tall man in a dark navy suit. The contrast between them was striking. For months, I had only seen her sitting across the street with worn luggage and simple clothing. Now she looked composed. Not wealthy. Not glamorous. Just completely different. More importantly, she looked like someone who had arrived with a purpose. The lawyer extended his hand. "My name is Cashin Roque." I shook it. His grip was firm. Professional. Nothing about him suggested aggression. Yet the sight of a lawyer standing inside my business made my stomach tighten. "Let's use my office," I said. Neither of them objected. A few minutes later, we sat across from each other. Cashin placed 3 thick folders onto my desk. The sound alone was enough to make me uncomfortable. I looked at the documents. Then at Isela. Then back at the lawyer. Finally, I spoke. "Should I be worried?" Cashin answered immediately. "Possibly." That was not reassuring. I leaned back in my chair. That's not exactly the answer people want to hear. "I prefer honesty." Fair enough. I respected that. Still, my pulse had already started climbing. Cashin opened the first folder. Inside were maps, property records, survey diagrams, ownership histories. Most of them looked decades old. I stared at the pages. None of it made sense. "What am I looking at?" Cashin glanced toward Isela before answering. "Land ownership records." I frowned. Why? Because your property appears inside them. That statement immediately got my attention. My property. My business. The land I legally purchased 11 years earlier. The land I had spent years developing. The land that represented nearly everything I owned. I leaned forward. What exactly are you saying? Cashin slid a document across the desk. According to the records, several neighboring lots had once belonged to a single family. The family name was highlighted. Voss. Isela's family. I looked up. Neither of them spoke. I continued reading. The document suggested that decades earlier, a large section of the harbor district had been owned by the Voss family before changing hands through a complicated chain of transactions. At first glance, everything appeared legal. But there were unusual gaps. Missing signatures. Missing transfer records. Missing approvals. The deeper I looked, the stranger it became. Finally, I placed the papers down. Are you claiming I stole property? The room became silent. Then Isela surprised me. No. I blinked. What? No. Farhan. That's not why we're here. I looked at Cashin. He nodded. We are not accusing you of theft. The tension inside me eased slightly. Only slightly. Because I still had no idea why they were sitting in my office. Then why bring a lawyer? Isela inhaled slowly. The answer came from her instead of Cashin. Because someone else may have stolen it. That immediately changed the conversation. I folded my arms. Start from the beginning. For several moments, Isela remained silent. I could tell she was organizing her thoughts. When she finally spoke, her voice sounded different from the woman I had known outside. Stronger. More controlled. My parents owned multiple warehouses near the harbor. I listened carefully. The properties increased in value after redevelopment plans were announced. Investors became interested. Large companies arrived. Then ownership disputes started appearing. She paused. At first, we thought they were simple legal mistakes. I nodded. That seemed reasonable. Administrative errors happened, especially with older properties. But then she continued. They weren't mistakes. I felt the atmosphere in the room shift. Someone was intentionally changing records. I stared at her. You're serious. Very. Cashin opened another folder. Inside were copies of legal filings stretching back years. There were dozens of them. Court petitions. Appeals. Ownership challenges. Investigations. Many had failed. Some had been dismissed. Others had simply disappeared within the legal system. The amount of effort represented by those documents was staggering. How long have you been working on this? I asked. Isela looked down at the table. Almost 9 years. 9 years. I struggled to process that. 9 years chasing property records. 9 years investigating paperwork. 9 years fighting a battle most people would have abandoned. Then I remembered something. The bus shelter. The maps. The old documents she constantly carried. Suddenly those memories made sense. At least partially. But one question remained. Who was responsible? As if reading my thoughts, Cashin closed the folder. Then he said a name. A single name. A name everyone in Greyport recognized. Draven Holt. The office fell silent. For several seconds, I simply stared at him. Surely I had heard incorrectly. Draven Holt was one of the most respected businessmen in the city. His face appeared in newspapers constantly. He funded charities, sponsored community projects, donated money to schools. Local politicians praised him regularly. I had even attended one of his fundraising events years earlier. He seemed untouchable. You think Draven Holt did this? Cashin's expression remained calm. We believe he benefited from it. That was a very careful answer. Lawyer language. Not a direct accusation. Not yet. I rubbed my forehead. The entire situation felt unreal. The homeless woman I had helped every morning was suddenly discussing a 9-year investigation involving one of the city's most powerful figures. Nothing about this felt normal. Then another realization hit me. A troubling realization. I looked directly at Isela. If all of this is true. She waited. Why were you sitting outside my business for months? For the first time, genuine emotion crossed her face. Not fear. Not nervousness. Determination. Because unlike before, she was finally ready to tell me the truth. Because your property wasn't random, Farhan. My chest tightened. What does that mean? Cashin opened the final folder. Inside was a detailed map of the harbor district. Several locations were circled. One circle surrounded my business. Another surrounded an abandoned warehouse 3 blocks away. Several more marked neighboring properties. Then Cashin pointed to a specific section. This area is the key to everything. I looked closer. My stomach immediately dropped. Because according to the map, my land wasn't merely connected to the dispute. It sat directly in the middle of it. And if the records were accurate, someone had spent years making sure nobody discovered why. I stared at the map for several seconds. The circles drawn across the harbor district looked deliberate. Not random. Not speculative. Every marked property appeared connected to a larger pattern. Unfortunately, my business sat almost exactly in the center. I looked up at Cashin. Then at Isela. Then back at the map. Explain this. Cashin nodded. That's why we're here. He rotated the map toward himself and pointed to a cluster of warehouses near the waterfront. Most of the buildings were old. Some had been renovated. Others had been abandoned for years. I recognized nearly all of them. The harbor district wasn't large enough to hide major properties. What am I looking at? I asked. Cashin tapped several locations with his pen. 23 years ago, these parcels belonged to only 3 families. His finger moved again. The Voss family owned the largest section. That matched what Isela had already told me. So what changed? Neither of them answered immediately. That silence worried me. Finally, Isela spoke. People started disappearing from the paperwork. I frowned. What does that mean? It means ownership records changed. She reached into her bag and produced several photocopies. The first document listed one set of owners. The second listed different owners. The third listed entirely new names. The dates were close together. Too close. These are official records? I asked. Yes. They don't match. Exactly. I felt a chill run through me. Administrative mistakes happened. But this many. Across multiple properties. Over multiple years. That was harder to dismiss. Cashin slid another document forward. Look at the signatures. I examined them carefully. Several looked similar. Almost identical. Then I noticed something strange. The handwriting changed slightly from document to document. Not enough for most people to notice. Enough for someone examining closely. These were forged. Cashin chose his words carefully. We believe they were altered. Lawyers really did love cautious language. I leaned back. The more evidence I saw, the less comfortable I became. Because if these records were genuine, then someone had manipulated ownership information for years without being caught. That required resources, connections, influence. Not the kind of operation a small criminal could manage. The kind a powerful person might. Then I remembered the name. Draven Holt. The thought immediately raised another question. If Holt was involved, Why hasn't anyone exposed him already? Isela laughed quietly. Not because the situation was funny. Because she had clearly asked herself that question hundreds of times. You think I haven't tried? I didn't answer. She continued. For years I brought evidence to investigators. She pulled another stack of papers from her bag. Nothing happened. More documents. More complaints. More reports. Some dated nearly a decade earlier. I slowly realized how much of her life had been consumed by this fight. While I had been building a company, she had been chasing records through government offices, archives, and courtrooms. Then another question surfaced. One that had bothered me since the beginning. Why stay near my business? This time she answered immediately. Because I believed something was hidden nearby. That answer surprised me. Hidden. Records. I stared at her. You spent months sitting across from my building because you thought documents were hidden nearby? When you say it out loud, it sounds crazy. It sounds very crazy. For the first time, she smiled. A genuine smile. Then it disappeared. Unfortunately, I was right. That got my attention. Cashin opened another folder. Inside were photographs. Most showed abandoned structures around the harbor. One photograph showed an old warehouse located 3 blocks from my business. I recognized it instantly. The building had been vacant for years. Its windows were boarded up. The roof needed repairs. Most people ignored it completely. What about it? Isela pointed toward the photograph. My father used to own that warehouse. I looked closer. The property looked worthless. Then again, appearances could be deceiving. What happened? He lost it. The answer sounded simple. The reality clearly wasn't. According to Isela, the warehouse had changed ownership multiple times under suspicious circumstances. Each transfer pushed it farther away from the Voss family. Eventually, it disappeared into a network of shell companies. The trail ended. Or appeared to end. Then came the twist. 6 months earlier, Isela discovered a forgotten maintenance report buried inside city archives. The report referenced a storage room beneath the warehouse. A room that never appeared on modern building plans. When she learned that information, she became convinced records had been hidden there. That was why she returned to Greyport. That was why she spent months monitoring the area. That was why she refused to leave. Suddenly, everything made sense. At least until the next twist arrived. Did you find the room? I asked. Isela nodded. My eyes widened. You found it. 3 weeks ago. Now I was completely invested. What was inside? She looked at Cashin. Cashin looked back at her. Neither spoke immediately. That silence told me the answer mattered. A lot. Finally, she responded. Nothing. I blinked. Nothing. The room had been emptied. My excitement vanished. For a moment nobody spoke. Then she continued. Recently. That single word changed everything. Recently. Not years ago. Not decades ago. Recently. Someone had accessed the room before her. Someone knew it existed. Someone had removed whatever had been stored there. And suddenly the entire situation became much more dangerous. I folded my arms. How recently? Less than a month. My office suddenly felt smaller. The implications were obvious. If hidden records existed and somebody removed them only weeks earlier, then somebody else was actively monitoring the same information. Someone who wanted the evidence gone. Someone who knew an investigation was getting close. Then another thought occurred to me. A disturbing one. How many people know about that room? Isela answered instantly. Very few. Then how did somebody beat you to it? The question lingered in the air. Neither of them had an answer. At least not yet. The conversation ended shortly afterward. Cashin needed to attend another meeting. Isela planned to continue reviewing records. Before leaving, she handed me a business card containing her temporary phone number. If anything unusual happens, call immediately. The request felt oddly specific. Why would something unusual happen? Her expression hardened. Because unlike me, she had spent years living inside this investigation. And she clearly understood risks I hadn't considered. If someone knows we're getting close, she said quietly, they may start making mistakes. I watched them leave. Then I looked back at the map spread across my desk. The circles. The properties. The missing records. The hidden room. The forged documents. The famous businessman whose name appeared repeatedly behind the scenes. Nothing about this was normal anymore. Still, I convinced myself the danger remained theoretical. I was wrong. Very wrong. Because less than 48 hours later, someone broke into my facility. And they weren't looking for cash. They weren't looking for equipment. They were searching for something far more specific. Something connected to the investigation. And when I reviewed the damage, I realized they knew exactly where to look. The break-in happened on a Wednesday night. I discovered it early Thursday morning. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The front gate remained locked. The exterior windows were intact. No alarms had been triggered. Everything appeared normal. Then I unlocked the office door. And immediately knew something was wrong. Papers covered the floor. File cabinets stood open. Storage boxes had been torn apart. Several shelves had been emptied. It looked as though someone had searched the building in a hurry. Not randomly. Systematically. My first thought was theft. That assumption lasted less than a minute. The computers were still there. The cash safe remained untouched. Expensive equipment hadn't been moved. Nothing valuable had disappeared. At least nothing valuable in the traditional sense. Someone had entered my business for a different reason. I called the police. Then I called Isela. She answered on the second ring. Farhan. They broke in. Silence. A long silence. Then her voice became serious. What did they take? I don't know yet. Don't touch anything. I'm already standing inside. Farhan, listen carefully. Her tone immediately got my attention. Okay. Did they search paper records? I looked around. Open folders covered the floor. Boxes containing old business documents had been ripped apart. Cabinets stood wide open. Yes. Another pause followed. Then she said exactly what I was afraid of hearing. They weren't looking for money. The police arrived 20 minutes later. Officers photographed everything. Collected fingerprints. Documented damage. Asked questions. Unfortunately, they found very little. Whoever entered the building knew what they were doing. There were no obvious signs of forced entry. No clear suspects. No useful camera footage. That last detail bothered me the most. Our security system should have recorded everything. Instead, several hours of footage had vanished. Deleted. Not damaged. Deleted. By lunchtime, frustration had replaced confusion. I reviewed inventory. Checked records. Examined every room. Nothing appeared missing. At least until I reached the archive section. The archives contained old property surveys, renovation permits, purchase agreements, and historical records connected to the business. Most were unimportant. But someone had searched them extensively. Boxes had been opened in a specific order. Files had been removed. Then returned. Whoever entered knew exactly where to look. That realization made my stomach tighten. Because there was only one reason somebody would search those archives. The investigation. By afternoon, Isela arrived. Cashin arrived shortly afterward. Together we walked through the damage. Neither looked surprised. Concerned, yes. Surprised, no. Which worried me even more. You expected this? I asked. Cashin crossed his arms. I was hoping it wouldn't happen. That wasn't an answer. But before I could push further, another person entered the building. A woman I had never seen before. She appeared to be in her early 40s. Dark hair. Rectangular glasses. Professional posture. She carried a hard case filled with documents and electronic equipment. Isela immediately stood. Farhan, this is Narina Quill. Narina extended her hand. I shook it. Nice to meet you. Her response was brief. I wish it were under better circumstances. Something about her suggested intense focus. The kind of person who noticed details other people missed. What do you do? I asked. I restore historical records. That answer surprised me. She noticed. City archives. Property records. Government documents. Legal restoration. Suddenly, I understood why she was here. Narina examined the damaged archive room. She spent nearly an hour saying very little. Instead, she studied everything. Shelves. Boxes. Folders. Labels. Dust patterns. Even the floor. Eventually, she crouched beside one of the filing cabinets. Then she smiled. Not a happy smile. The kind people make when they discover something important. What? I asked. She pointed. Most people would have missed it. A faint layer of dust covered the cabinet. Except for one section. That section had recently been touched. Narina opened the drawer. Inside were property surveys dating back more than 20 years. Nothing seemed unusual. Then she pulled out a specific file. Interesting. Cashin stepped closer. What is it? Narina removed several pages. Then she placed them on a table. At first glance they appeared ordinary. Survey maps. Ownership diagrams. Parcel references. But Narina wasn't looking at the documents themselves. She was looking at the paper. These don't belong here. I frowned. What do you mean? She held one sheet beside another. The aging is wrong. Nobody spoke. Narina continued. This file claims to be 23 years old. She tapped the first page. This page is. Then she tapped the second. This one isn't. I stared at her. You can tell that? Yes. That single discovery changed everything. Over the next 2 hours, Narina inspected dozens of records. Her findings became increasingly disturbing. Several pages had been replaced. Others had been modified. Some appeared authentic. Others clearly did not. Yet the alterations were sophisticated. Almost invisible. Designed to survive casual inspection. Finally, Narina leaned back in her chair. What you're dealing with isn't random corruption. The room became silent. She looked directly at me. Someone spent years rewriting history. A chill moved through me. Because hearing it from Isela was one thing. Hearing it from an independent expert was something else entirely. Then came the biggest shock. Narina opened her hard case and removed specialized imaging equipment. For the next hour she scanned several altered documents. Layer by layer. Mark by mark. Eventually hidden impressions began appearing beneath replacement pages. The room fell completely silent. Names emerged. Old signatures. Ownership information. Data that had supposedly disappeared years earlier. And every new discovery pointed in the same direction. The Voss family had owned far more property than official records currently showed. Someone had deliberately erased portions of that ownership history. When the final scan finished, Narina slowly removed her glasses. I can prove these files were altered. Nobody spoke. Then Cashin asked the obvious question. Can you prove who altered them? Narina's expression changed. Not excitement. Concern. Because the answer wasn't simple. No. The room immediately lost energy. Then she continued. But I can prove something else. We waited. She looked directly at Isela. Then at me. Then at Cashin. The person responsible had help. I felt my chest tighten. Help from who? Narina organized several documents into a neat stack. When she finally answered, her voice was calm. Too calm. The alterations required archive access. Nobody interrupted. Not temporary access. She paused. Permanent access. I immediately understood what she was saying. Someone inside the system had participated. Someone with authority. Someone with credentials. Someone capable of modifying official records without attracting attention. A government employee. Maybe more than one. Suddenly this wasn't just a dispute about missing property. It was organized corruption. Years of it. Possibly decades. And if powerful people were involved, then the break-in at my business wasn't an act of desperation. It was damage control. Someone was trying to contain the truth. The realization settled heavily over the room. Then my phone vibrated. A message appeared from an unknown number. No greeting. No signature. Just one sentence. One sentence that immediately made every hair on my arms stand up. Stop looking into the harbor records. Or the next visit won't be to your office. I stared at the message for several seconds. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The words seemed simple. But the meaning behind them was unmistakable. It was a threat. A direct threat. Not against my business. Against me. Slowly, I handed my phone to Cashin. He read the message once. Then again. His expression hardened. Don't delete this. I wasn't planning to. Isela stepped closer. Are you okay? I honestly didn't know how to answer that question. Less than 4 months earlier, my biggest concern had been late deliveries and equipment maintenance. Now I was receiving anonymous threats connected to a decades-old property conspiracy. Nothing about my life felt normal anymore. The message was immediately forwarded to investigators. Unfortunately, the results were disappointing. The number had been routed through multiple prepaid devices. No useful identity. No immediate lead. Exactly the kind of method someone experienced would use. Over the next several weeks, events accelerated. What had once been a private investigation became a public issue. Narina's findings attracted attention. Journalists began asking questions. Independent researchers reviewed historical records. Former city employees quietly reached out. And for the first time, cracks started appearing in the wall surrounding Draven Holt. The city administration could no longer ignore the growing evidence. A special public hearing was announced. Officially, it was intended to review allegations involving historical property transfers and record manipulation. Unofficially, everyone knew exactly who the hearing was really about. Draven Holt. The announcement dominated local news. For days, television stations discussed nothing else. Talk shows debated the evidence. Business leaders issued statements. Politicians suddenly became cautious whenever reporters mentioned Holt's name. The closer the hearing approached, the more nervous people became. Including me. The hearing itself took place inside Greyport Civic Hall. The building stood downtown, overlooking the waterfront. By the time I arrived, hundreds of people had already gathered outside. News vans lined the street. Cameras pointed toward the entrance. Reporters interviewed anyone willing to speak. Security officers controlled access. The atmosphere felt more like a major criminal trial than a public review meeting. Inside, every seat was occupied. Additional spectators stood against the walls. Journalists filled entire rows. Government officials occupied the front section, and near the center sat Draven Holt. For the first time since this investigation began, I saw him in person. He appeared exactly as expected, confident, well-dressed, calm. If he felt pressure, he didn't show it. Several attorneys surrounded him. Expensive attorneys. The kind powerful people hire when they expect trouble. The hearing began shortly after 9 o'clock. Opening statements lasted nearly an hour. Most consisted of technical explanations involving land records and archival procedures. Then Narina Quill took the stand. The room immediately became quieter. Everyone understood her importance. Without her discoveries, none of this would have progressed so far. Narina spoke clearly, methodically. She explained how records had been altered, how replacement pages had been inserted, how original information had been concealed. Then she presented the scans. Large screens displayed the evidence. Side-by-side comparisons appeared before the audience. Original records, altered records, hidden ownership details, missing names. The differences were impossible to ignore. For the first time, visible concern appeared among several city officials. The evidence was stronger than many expected. Yet the biggest revelation had not arrived. That came later. Cashin Roque presented financial documents connecting multiple shell companies to properties once owned by the Voss family. The ownership chains appeared deliberately complicated. Company after company. Transfer after transfer. Layer after layer. But eventually every path pointed toward the same destination. Organizations linked to Draven Holt. Murmurs spread throughout the room. Reporters scribbled notes furiously. Camera operators zoomed in. For the first time, Holt's legal team appeared uncomfortable. Still, they fought back. They challenged timelines, questioned interpretations, argued technicalities. For several hours the outcome remained uncertain. Then everything changed. A man entered the hearing room shortly after lunch. I had never seen him before. Most people hadn't. Yet the reaction from Cashin was immediate. He stood up. Isella looked stunned. Even Narina appeared surprised. The newcomer introduced himself. Eldrick Sorn. The name meant nothing to me. At least initially. Then he began speaking. And the entire room transformed. Eldrick had worked as an accountant. Not for Draven Holt directly. For one of the shell companies connected to the disputed properties. 4 years he managed financial records. For years he remained silent. Until now. The evidence he brought was devastating. Boxes of ledgers. Transaction logs. Internal payment records. Authorization forms. Documents nobody knew existed. One by one they were introduced into evidence. The financial trail became impossible to dismiss. Payments flowed through multiple entities, eventually reaching individuals connected to city record offices. The implication was obvious. Bribes. Not rumors. Not suspicions. Actual documented payments. The room became completely silent. Then came the final blow. Eldrick produced a collection of signed authorizations. Several bore Draven Holt's signature. Not copies. Originals. Verified originals. For the first time all day, Holt visibly reacted. His confidence disappeared. Only briefly. But everyone saw it. Journalists certainly did. Within minutes, reporters were sending updates across every major news outlet in Greyport. The hearing continued into the evening. By the end, the atmosphere had changed entirely. The question was no longer whether wrongdoing occurred. The question was how many people had participated. Outside the building, crowds gathered around news screens. Inside, investigators requested immediate access to additional records. And Draven Holt left surrounded by attorneys and security personnel. The untouchable businessman no longer looked untouchable. Still, the story wasn't finished. Not even close. Because later that night, after the hearing ended, Isela called me. Her voice sounded different. Not relieved. Not excited. Concerned. Farhan, there's something you need to know. I was exhausted. What happened? Several seconds passed. Then she delivered the last twist I expected. A twist that changed the entire story once again. The truth about me isn't what you think. I sat upright immediately. What are you talking about? Her answer came quietly. The woman you've been helping all these months. She paused. Was never actually the full story. And the next morning, I finally learned who Isela Voss really was. I barely slept after receiving Isela's phone call. Her words repeated in my mind for hours. The woman you've been helping all these months was never actually the full story. I kept wondering what she meant. Had she lied about her identity? Had she hidden another part of the investigation? Was there yet another secret waiting to surface? After everything that had happened, I honestly didn't know what to expect anymore. The next morning, she asked me to meet her downtown. The location surprised me. It wasn't a government office. It wasn't a law firm. And it certainly wasn't another archive building. Instead, she gave me the address of a recently renovated office complex overlooking the harbor. The same harbor that had caused so much destruction in her life. I arrived shortly before 10 o'clock. The building looked impressive. Modern glass exterior. Private security. Corporate tenants. Definitely not the kind of place I associated with the woman who had spent months sitting across from my business. When I entered the lobby, a receptionist greeted me. Mr. Mahler? Yes. Ms. Voss is expecting you. That sentence alone felt strange. The receptionist escorted me to the top floor. When the elevator doors opened, I found Isela waiting near a conference room. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she smiled. A calm smile. Not the guarded expression I had become accustomed to. Something about her seemed lighter. As if a burden she had carried for years was finally beginning to disappear. Thanks for coming. I needed answers. I know. She gestured toward the conference room. We sat down across from each other. Large windows overlooked the waterfront. From where I sat, I could actually see part of the harbor district, including the area where Blue Harbor Linen Works operated. The site felt strangely symbolic. Months earlier, everything had started there. Now, everything was ending here. Finally, I asked the question. What didn't you tell me? Isela took a slow breath. Then she answered honestly. Most people assumed I was homeless. I nodded. That's what I thought. I know. She folded her hands together. I never corrected anyone. That statement caught my attention. Why not? Because it made people ignore me. I frowned. She continued. People reveal things when they believe you have no power. That wasn't entirely wrong. I had seen it happen before. People often behaved differently around those they considered unimportant. Still, there was a difference between allowing assumptions and intentionally creating them. Were you pretending? She shook her head. No. That answer surprised me. For the next several minutes, she explained everything. Years earlier, after her family's legal battles began, several assets had been placed into protected trusts. The assets existed, but accessing them required resolving complicated ownership disputes. Without legal resolution, much of the inheritance remained effectively frozen. As a result, she spent years funding investigations, legal reviews, historical research, and court proceedings. The process consumed enormous resources. By the time she returned to Greyport, she was surviving carefully while dedicating almost everything toward proving what had happened. She had not been wealthy. She had not been homeless. The truth existed somewhere between those extremes. And unlike the stories many people would later invent, there had been no elaborate scam. No secret manipulation. No attempt to deceive me for personal gain. She simply chose not to explain her entire life story to every stranger who offered coffee. When she put it that way, it sounded completely reasonable. Then another realization hit me. You could have left years ago. Yes. But you stayed. Yes. Why? For the first time, emotion appeared in her eyes. Because this answer mattered more than any legal victory. Because somebody erased my family. The room became silent. Not physically erased. Not murdered. Not disappeared. Something different. Their history had been erased. Their ownership had been erased. Their reputation had been erased. Official records had been rewritten until it appeared they had never mattered. And she refused to accept that. No matter how long it took. No matter how difficult it became. For 9 years she fought to restore the truth. Now, finally, she had succeeded. Over the following months, events moved quickly. Investigators expanded their inquiries. Additional evidence emerged. Several public officials resigned. Others faced criminal charges. Multiple property transfers were reversed. Financial penalties followed. Civil lawsuits multiplied. The system that had protected powerful people for decades began collapsing piece by piece. And at the center of it all stood Draven Holt, the man who once controlled the narrative. The man who believed influence could bury history. The man who believed nobody would ever connect the missing records. He was wrong. The criminal proceedings against him lasted nearly a year. Every month revealed new information. Additional shell companies. Additional payments. Additional conspirators. The evidence became overwhelming. Eventually, convictions followed. Several associates accepted plea agreements. Others cooperated with prosecutors. The empire Holt spent decades constructing began falling apart. His business reputation disappeared. His political connections vanished. His charitable organizations underwent investigation. Many closed permanently. The public image that once protected him became worthless. Ironically, the thing he valued most wasn't his money. It was his reputation. And that was the very thing he lost. That was his karma. Not a dramatic act of revenge. Not violence. Not humiliation for entertainment. The truth itself became the punishment. As for Isella, the outcome was different. Large portions of her family's historical holdings were restored through settlements and court rulings. Several properties returned to her control. Others resulted in compensation agreements. For the first time in nearly a decade, she no longer needed to spend every waking moment fighting. Then, one afternoon, she surprised me again. We met at a waterfront cafe overlooking the harbor. The same harbor that had connected our lives. After discussing business and legal updates for nearly an hour, she handed me a folder. I opened it. Inside was a formal investment proposal. I looked up. What is this? A partnership opportunity. I laughed. You're serious. Completely. According to the proposal, she wanted to invest in expanding Blue Harbor Linen Works. Not because she felt obligated. Not because she owed me anything. Because she believed in the business. And because, during one of the most difficult periods of her life, I treated her with kindness before knowing who she was. Months later, construction began on a second facility. Eventually, a third location followed. The company grew beyond anything I originally imagined. Looking back now, I sometimes think about that first morning. The bus shelter. The coffee. The conversation that lasted less than 30 seconds. At the time, it seemed insignificant. Just a small act of kindness before work. I never imagined it would lead to uncovering corruption, exposing a powerful businessman, restoring a family's history, and changing the direction of my own life. But that's exactly what happened. And if there's one lesson I took from everything, It's this. You never truly know who someone is when you first meet them. The person sitting quietly on the other side of the street may be carrying a story far bigger than anyone realizes. And sometimes, the simplest decision, offering help to someone who appears to need it, can change far more lives than your own. The end. Thank you for reading my story. If you enjoyed this journey filled with mysteries, twists, hidden secrets, corruption, justice, and unexpected friendships, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Tell me in the comments. At which moment did you realize Draven Holt was guilty? And which twist surprised you the most? See you in the next story.